It started as an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind where you wake up late and shuffle around the house in your pajamas. The sun streamed through the windows, and everything felt calm and familiar. My brother and I had been getting along better than usual lately, probably because we'd both been so busy with our own lives. He's 2 years older than me, someone I've always looked up to, even if we don't always see eye to eye. That day, I wasn't expecting anything unusual, let alone something that would completely change how I looked at him. I was in the middle of tidying up my room when I realized I'd accidentally borrowed one of his books. He's always been the bookworm in the family, constantly leaving piles of novels and journals scattered everywhere. I figured I'd just sneak it back into his room without bothering him. That's what siblings do, right? So, I grabbed the book and headed toward his room, not thinking much of it. His door was cracked open slightly, and I didn't hear any noise coming from inside. I assumed he wasn't there. As I pushed the door open wider, I caught sight of his desk, which was always an organized chaos of notes, pens, and random gadgets. I set the book down, but something on the edge of his desk caught my eye. At first, I didn't even realize what it was. Just some papers and a small notebook tucked underneath. But something about the way it was half hidden felt strange, almost deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and flipped it open. What I saw stopped me cold. My heart started racing as I stared at the contents of that notebook. It wasn't anything like I'd imagined. This wasn't school notes or some random doodles. It was deeply personal, something he clearly hadn't intended for anyone to see. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was reading. Should I put it back? Pretend I never saw it? But part of me couldn't look away, like I'd stumbled upon a side of him I never knew existed. Just as I started to close the notebook, I heard a noise behind me. My brother's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "What are you doing?" I froze, my hands trembling, and turned around to see him standing there in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, part shock, part something else I couldn't quite place. In that moment, I realized there was no way to undo what had just happened. Before I could even stammer out an explanation, he stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the notebook in my hands. "You shouldn't have looked at that," he said quietly, but there was an edge to his voice that made my stomach twist. For a second, neither of us moved. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on us. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. My brother's eyes flicked from the notebook to me, and then back again. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a tension in his face that made it clear I'd crossed a line. I didn't mean to," I started, but he cut me off. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said again, this time more firmly. His voice wasn't loud, but there was a weight to it that made my chest tighten. He stepped closer, reaching for the notebook, and I handed it over without hesitation. "I thought it was just..." My voice trailed off as I realized there was no way to explain what I'd done without sounding nosy. "I wasn't trying to..." "Forget it," he muttered, shoving the notebook into a drawer and slamming it shut. The sound made me flinch, and for a moment I thought he was going to yell or lose his temper. But instead, he just stood there, staring at the closed drawer like it held something far heavier than a few sheets of paper. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to back out of the room and pretend this never happened. But another part of me, one I couldn't quite explain, felt like I needed to understand. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the way he looked, like he was carrying something too big to handle on his own. "I wasn't trying to pry," I said softly. "I didn't mean to invade your space." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, a habit I'd seen 100 times when he was stressed. "It's fine," he said, but his tone made it clear that it wasn't. "Just don't touch my stuff again, okay?" I nodded, feeling a mix of guilt and unease. "I'm sorry," I said again, even though the words felt small compared to the tension hanging in the air. For a moment, I thought he was going to let it go, but then he turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Not much," I admitted. "Just some writing." His jaw tightened and he looked away, his eyes fixed on a spot somewhere on the floor. "It's personal," he said finally. "It's not something I talk about." "Okay," I said quickly. "I get it. I won't say anything." But even as I said the words, I could feel the questions bubbling up inside me. What was in that notebook that he was so desperate to keep hidden? And why did he seem so burdened by it? The silence between us stretched on, heavy and awkward. Finally, he shook his head and muttered, "Just forget it," before walking past me and out of the room. But I couldn't forget it. Not the look on his face, not the weight in his voice, and definitely not the few words I'd managed to glimpse before I closed the notebook. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was keeping inside was something big, something I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. The rest of the day felt strange, like the air in the house had shifted. My brother stayed in his room, the door shut tight, and I could hear the faint sound of his music playing. Usually, that would mean he was unwinding, but something told me this time was different. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, watching random videos, but my mind kept drifting back to the notebook and the way he reacted. I couldn't stop wondering about it. What was he hiding? And why did it seem to weigh so heavily on him? It wasn't like him to be so guarded. Sure, we weren't the type of siblings who shared everything, but he wasn't secretive either. At dinner, things felt even more off. He barely said a word, just poked at his food while our parents chatted about their day. I caught myself stealing glances at him, trying to read his expression, but it was like a wall had gone up. Afterward, I thought about knocking on his door to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? Instead, I stayed in my room, replaying the moment in my head. I kept thinking about those few words I'd read before he caught me. They didn't make much sense on their own, but there was something raw about them, like they'd been written in a moment of real vulnerability. The next morning, I decided to try a different approach. I figured if I acted normal, maybe he would too. So, I made a point of sitting next to him on the couch while he was watching TV. For a while, it was just the two of us in silence, the sound of some old action movie filling the room. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask, "Are you okay?" He glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah, why?" "I don't know," I said, trying to sound casual. "You've just seemed quiet." He hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the screen. "I'm fine," he said, but there was an edge to his voice that told me otherwise. "Look," I said gently, "I know I messed up yesterday. I shouldn't have touched your stuff, but if there's something bothering you, you can talk to me. I mean it." For a moment, I thought he might open up. His expression softened just enough for me to catch a glimpse of something. Pain, maybe, or fear. But then, just as quickly, the wall came back up. "It's nothing," he said, standing up abruptly. "Don't worry about it." And just like that, he walked away again, leaving me sitting there with more questions than answers. The days that followed felt like walking on eggshells. My brother and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was short, surface-level stuff. Pass the salt, or "What time are you leaving?" He wasn't angry, exactly, but he was distant, and the distance felt heavier than anything else. It was as if something invisible had settled between us, growing thicker every time I caught him avoiding eye contact or heard him close his door just a little too firmly. but I couldn't let it go. I tried. I really did. But my curiosity kept pulling me back to that moment. I kept wondering about the notebook, the few fragmented lines I'd glimpsed before he took it away. The words were vague, but they hinted at something deeply personal, something he'd been keeping inside for a long time. One night, I found myself standing outside his room. His light was on, spilling faintly through the bottom of the door. I could hear the quiet hum of music, the kind he always played when he was in his own world. For a moment, I considered knocking, just asking him outright what was going on. But I froze, unsure if I even had the right to push him like that. I turned to leave when I heard something unexpected, a muffled voice. At first, I thought he was talking to someone, but as I pressed my ear closer to the door, I realized it wasn't a conversation. It was him, speaking low and unevenly, like he was rehearsing something or confessing. I couldn't make out all the words, just fragments here and there. I didn't mean to. I can't keep doing this, and what if they find out? My heart raced as I stepped back from the door, my mind spinning. Who was he talking about? What was he hiding? Every possibility that ran through my head made my stomach twist. I thought about the notebook, about the weight he'd been carrying around, and it all started to feel bigger than I'd imagined. I stayed up late that night, replaying the moment over and over in my head. My thoughts were a mix of worry and frustration. I wanted to help him, but how could I when he wouldn't let me in? And what if whatever he was hiding was something I wasn't ready to know? The next day, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The drawer where he'd hidden the notebook was slightly open, just enough to see the corner of it sticking out. It felt like a sign, like the universe was daring me to take one more look. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the drawer, torn between my instincts and my conscience. But before I could decide, I heard footsteps behind me, and my brother's voice, sharp and unmistakable, cut through the silence. "What are you doing now?" he demanded. I froze, my hand still hovering near the drawer, every muscle in my body tense. My brother stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. He looked between me and the slightly open drawer, and I could see the realization hit him like a wave. His jaw clenched, and for a second I thought he might start yelling, but instead, he just shook his head. "What's wrong with you?" he said, his voice low but sharp, like he was trying to hold back something bigger. "Didn't I make it clear yesterday? Stay out of my stuff." I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, and the air between us felt suffocating. "Don't lie to me," he said, cutting me off. "You were going to look again, weren't you?" I wanted to deny it, to say I'd just happened to notice the drawer and wasn't planning anything, but we both knew it wasn't true. The guilt was written all over my face, and there was no point pretending otherwise. I stammered, searching for the right words. "I feel like something's going on with you, and you won't talk to me about it. I'm worried, okay?" He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he let out a bitter laugh. "Worried?" he repeated almost mockingly. "You're not worried. You're just curious. You want to know what's in the notebook because you can't stand not knowing." His words stung, mostly because there was some truth to them. But it wasn't just curiosity, it was something more. I could see how much he was struggling, how much whatever he was hiding was weighing on him, and I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "You're right," I admitted. "I do want to know, but not because I'm nosy. I want to know because I care about you, and because whatever it is, it's eating you up inside." His expression softened for just a moment, like he was letting his guard down, but then it hardened again. He turned away from me, running a hand through his hair, and I could see the conflict playing out on his face. "It's not something you can fix," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And even if I told you, it wouldn't make a difference." "Maybe not," I said gently, taking a step closer. "But it might help to let someone else carry the weight for a little while." For a moment, I thought he might actually open up. He stood there staring at the wall, his shoulders tense and his breathing uneven. But then he turned back to me, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down my spine. "You really want to know?" he asked, his tone sharp and almost daring. "Fine, I'll tell you, but don't say I didn't warn you." Before I could respond, he walked to the drawer, yanked it open, and grabbed the notebook. He held it out to me, his hand trembling slightly. "Go ahead," he said. "Read it. See for yourself." I stared at the notebook, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment I'd been pushing for. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. Something about the look on his face told me that whatever was inside those pages was bigger and darker than anything I'd imagined. I hesitated, my eyes locked on the notebook in his hand. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to let this moment pass, but I couldn't. I'd pushed too far to stop now. Slowly, I reached out and took it from him, the leather cover feeling heavier than it should have. He stepped back, crossing his arms tightly like he was bracing himself for what was about to happen. With trembling fingers, I opened the notebook. At first, the pages seemed normal, scraps of writing, half-finished thoughts, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in someone's journal. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted. The entries became more scattered, the handwriting more frantic. The words painted a picture of someone wrestling with something deeply personal, something that felt too big to handle alone. My brother had written about feeling trapped, about carrying a secret he couldn't share, about the fear of being judged. My heart sank as I realized how much he'd been holding inside, right under my nose. But then I turned to the last few pages and everything changed. The entries weren't just emotional anymore. They were specific. He'd written about an incident that had happened months ago, something he'd been blaming himself for ever since. At first, I didn't understand what he was talking about. But then I saw the name. A friend of his. Someone I barely knew, but whose face I could vaguely picture. The more I read, the clearer it became. My brother believed he'd let this person down in a way that couldn't be undone. "I didn't mean for it to happen," one entry said. "If I'd just said something sooner, maybe they'd still be here." I froze, my mind racing. Still be here? What did that mean? I looked up at my brother, who was watching me with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It wasn't your fault," I said, my voice shaking. "Whatever happened, you can't carry this alone." He let out a shaky breath, his eyes glistening. "You don't get it," he said. "I was the last person they talked to. They were asking for help and I didn't see it. I didn't take it seriously. And now..." His voice broke, and he turned away, his shoulders slumping. The pieces clicked into place and my stomach twisted. He wasn't just blaming himself. He genuinely believed he was responsible for someone's death. "It wasn't your fault," I repeated, stepping closer. "You didn't know. You couldn't have known." He shook his head, wiping at his eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it," he whispered. "Every day it's like it's happening all over again." I placed the notebook down and reached for his arm. "You can't change the past," I said softly, "but you can stop letting it destroy you. Talk to someone, a counselor maybe. Let them help you work through this." He didn't respond right away, but finally he nodded, a small, hesitant movement. It wasn't much, but it was something. As I turned to leave, I glanced at the notebook one last time. That's when I noticed something strange. A single page folded in half, tucked into the back cover. Curious, I opened it. The words on the page weren't his. They were typed, like an email or a message. And as I read them, my blood ran cold. "I know what you did," it said. You can't hide from this forever." I stared at the page, my mind racing with 100 questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. This wasn't over. The page trembled in my hands as I stared at those chilling words. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. Who could have sent this? And what did they know? I glanced at my brother, who had slumped onto his bed, lost in his own storm of guilt. A part of me wanted to show him the note immediately, but something held me back. He was already teetering on the edge. This would push him further, and I wasn't sure he could handle it. I carefully folded the page and slipped it into my pocket, deciding I'd deal with it later. Right now, my brother needed me. I sat down next to him, the weight of everything we'd uncovered sitting heavily between us. "You're not alone," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "Whatever this is, whatever you're going through, we'll figure it out together. But you have to let me in. You have to let someone in." He looked at me, his eyes red and filled with something I hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "Maybe you don't have to fix it all at once," I said. "Maybe it's just about taking one step at a time." Over the next few days, we started to piece things together. My brother opened up about his friend, about the last conversation they'd had and the guilt he'd been carrying ever since. It was heartbreaking to hear, but it also gave me clarity. He wasn't a villain or someone to blame. He was just a person who'd made a mistake, one that felt much bigger in hindsight than it ever could have in the moment. With my encouragement, he agreed to talk to a counselor. It wasn't easy for him. He hated the idea of being vulnerable with a stranger, but he knew he couldn't keep carrying this weight alone. The first session was hard, but by the second, I could already see a change in him. He wasn't fixed, not by any means, but there was a lightness in his voice, a sense that he might finally be able to breathe again. As for the note, I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't just some prank or meaningless message. It lingered in my mind like an unresolved melody, but as the days turned into weeks, nothing else happened. No follow-ups, no threats. Slowly, the fear it sparked began to fade, though the curiosity never did. In the end, life went on. My brother started to heal, little by little, and our relationship grew stronger in the process. If nothing else, this experience taught me how important it is to pay attention to the people you love, to the things they don't say, to the silent burdens they carry. Not everything was tied up neatly. Some questions would never have answers, and some wounds would always leave scars. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. And so did he. That was enough.